Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Armenian Studies Program lecture series. I'm Professor Barlo Dermagrdician. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is actually the first in the fall lecture series of the Armenian Studies Program. And after tonight's presentation, you will have an opportunity to ask questions, but please use the chat area at the bottom of your screen, and you can write questions at any time, even during the lecture. And at the end of the lecture, I will be reading those to our guest, and then he will be responding to those questions. I also want to tell you a little bit about our upcoming events. Our next event in the Armenian Studies Program series is going to take place on Friday, September the 17th at 7 p.m. California time, when our speaker will be Dr. Suren Manukyan. And he is the 18th visiting professor, Kazan visiting professor in Armenian Studies at Fresno State. And his specialty is on the Armenian genocide. He is actually teaching a course on comparative genocide for our students here at Fresno State. And he will be giving a three-part lecture. And the first lecture is called The Architects of the Armenian Genocide, the Top-Level Perpetrators. So you can find out more information about that again through Facebook or through our website, and find out, again, it will be a Zoom meeting because, again, we are not coming on campus with our lectures. This evening, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nerses Kopalyan. He is an assistant professor in residence of political science at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. His fields of specialization include international relations, geopolitics, political theory, and the philosophy of science. And he has conducted extensive research on the questions of polarity, superpower relations, and security studies. He's also the author of several monographs. But more importantly for us, he has done extensive work on political developments in Armenia prior to and after the Velvet Revolution. The Velvet Revolution was the 2018 revolution, which brought in the current Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan. And he has authored several policy papers for the government of Armenia and has served as advisor to the government. And we were just talking before the presentation today. He has already been to Armenia twice this year, working with various people, setting up different kinds of things that he'll be talking about. And he'll be visiting again very soon. And more recently, he undertook a polling project in Armenia, conducting a pre-election survey on the 2021 parliamentary snap elections. Tonight, Dr. Kopalyan is going to speak on the topic of democratic resilience amidst security crisis, Armenia's political climate after the 2020 Artsakh war. And just very briefly, because he'll talk about what he's going to talk about, this is going to look at actually two crises that arose out of the 2020 Artsakh war. One in the area of security architecture, the national security of Armenia, and the other deals with its domestic politics. So he will be talking about those two topics tonight. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kopalyan to Fresno State as it is and to speak tonight. Thank you, Dr. Kopalyan.
Thank you, Dr. Dermagrdician, for having me, and I want to express my gratitude for the Fresno State Armenian Studies program. So yes, today I'm going to be covering sort of the nuances that explains Armenia's current political climate after the Artsakh war, and we're going to specifically address the various dynamics that explain the various configurations of Armenia's democracy amidst the security crisis that Armenia finds itself in right now. So let me get the PowerPoint going. Okay. So as the title suggests, we're going to be basically talking about the various important issues about democratic resilience and the extent to which Armenia's nascent democracy has been able to survive amidst all the security crisis that it is facing right now. Okay, so we see that the post-war crisis in Armenia's domestic political theater after the November 9 ceasefire produced a wide range of conceptual concerns about the viability of the democratic gains obtained after the Velvet Revolution. and there was a broader narrative that sought to qualify the discourse into this sort of rigid dichotomy, security and stability versus democracy and state failure. And I'm one of those scholars who contends that, based on the extant data and empirical observations, the attempt to construct such a dichotomy fundamentally failed. And so the results of the recent snap parliamentary elections, the growth of Armenia's democratic culture, and what we've seen in the increased citizen trust in Armenia's institutions provide very strong explanations for the endurance and resilience of Armenia's nascent democracy, even amidst a security crisis. Now, these developments, of course, have given birth to a set of questions that have puzzled many observers, both in the diaspora as well as in Armenia proper. I know these observations have pretty much brought about the questions that I have up here. Okay, so the first answer, the first question that we're going to address within the broader context of my talk is, how did the incumbent prime minister and his civil contract party, whose government lost the war, right, and committed was considered to be the ultimate sin of Armenian politics, that of losing land, right? How did they still manage such an electoral success? Okay. So how did Pashinyan's party, even after the political crisis that ensued after November 9, and facing a rather formidable and a very well-financed opposition, deliver a landslide victory? And collectively, how can we understand the dynamics of Armenian society that overwhelmingly voted for a party that not only suffered a military defeat, but continues to struggle in resolving Armenia's security crises? So, in essence, we're attempting to understand at the fundamental level how Armenia's post-Velvet democracy continues to survive in the face of all of these odds that the country is facing. And, my broader research and a lot of observational assessments based on the existing data, whether it's survey data or a survey that I've been part of in conducting in Armenia, a lot of these have sort of, as I accumulated the content, I was able to obtain 4 general explanatory variables to answer these questions. And the first thing we're going to talk about that tries to explain these developments is the burgeoning democratic culture that we're seeing in Armenia. Second, we're going to see how increased citizen trust in political and state institutions led to the electoral success that we saw of the current government. Third, we're going to consider how the legacy of the Velvet Revolution and democratic elections actually have long-term effects. And fourth, we're also going to see how the opposition in Armenia was electorally weak. They were not financially weak, and they had a very big microphone, right, when it came to proliferating their ideas, but electorally they proved to be quite weak. And we're going to see why and how that explains the continuation of Armenia's growing democratic culture. So the patterns of development in political culture within non-democratic societies, to a large extent, is contingent on a broad range of factors. Okay, and the most crucial of these remain the level and magnitude of authoritarianism. When we look at the post-Soviet space, for example, political systems has fluctuated from full authoritarianism, as I have up here with some examples, to rigid hybrid regimes. And hybrid regimes are basically sort of these competitive authoritarian structures that we're talking about, okay? From those factors to all the way what we call loose hybrid regimes. And this is kind of what we had in pre-revolution Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia. So before Ukraine had their Euromaidan, before Georgia had their Rose Revolution, and before Armenia had the Velvet Revolution, they had what were called loose hybrid regimes. And so regime types have fluctuated in the post-Soviet space, primarily among these types of structures. And what we saw was that the formation of enduring cultural syndromes that promote conduciveness to democratization and democratic political culture are actually found in loose hybrid regimes. This remains impossible, of course, in authoritarian regimes and exceedingly difficult in rigid hybrid regimes. Thus, it is within loose hybrid regimes that nascent democratic culture, democratic values, and citizen activism reinforce the growth of civic society and the demand for systemic change. The outcome, as observed in Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia, are what we call democratic breakthroughs, where they succeed in dismantling the loose hybrid regime. Armenia's political culture in this context prior to the failed revolution remained consistent with much of these developments we see in the literature, where we saw the development of cultural syndromes that promoted some form of democratic values. But these, however, were overwhelmed by a socio-political system right before the Velvet that had culturally normalized corruption, nepotism, and conformity to abuse of power. Thus, whereas Armenia's post-Velvet political culture may be defined as a burgeoning democratic culture, the pre-Velvet political culture may be defined as a latent democratic culture. To this end, the Velvet Revolution did not happen in a vacuum. A latent democratic culture incrementally developed over a decade, slowly producing enduring cultural syndromes that offer the ideational structure for a democratic breakthrough. And so the empirical findings demonstrate a robust support for democratization of Armenia's political culture during the post-Velvet stage. And I called some data from the 2020 Caucasus Barometer, and the findings clearly demonstrate that the post-Velvet burgeoning democratic culture has not simply been temporary or euphoric, that many had argued, but rather it has become part of an enduring cultural syndrome. As we see some of the data I have up here, for example, 85% of post-Velvet society affirm that Armenia is a democratic country. Within this affirmation, however, we saw this was tempered by a set of very pragmatic observations. 37% conceded that while Armenia is a democracy, it does have major problems. 30% held it is democracy with minor problems. And we did have 18% that actually believed Armenia is a full democracy. And so overarchingly, right, sometime after the Velvet, by about 2020, so 2 years after, the post-Velvet society's healthy and diverse perceptions of its democracy and its shared culture of attitudes solidified the burgeoning democratic culture thesis. This was further reinforced by what we saw in the 2021 IRA survey, which was released in May. IRA had two surveys, one in February, one in May. We're going to be covering both, but for the specific instance, I have the May data, some of the May data out here. And when when citizens were asked whether democracy is the best form of government, 48% responded positively, although about 18% suggested an alternative. But then we had another interesting assessment here. At the same time, respondents did not display satisfaction with the way Armenia's democracy was proceeding. So this is already after the war, right? It's in May of 2021, and we saw citizens having a level of discomfort with the way Armenian society is going. And approximately 63% displayed some satisfaction. But here's the interesting part. Okay, this satisfaction did not translate to votes for the non-democratic parties, hence suggesting the endurance of democratic cultural syndromes. And this became evident in the pre-election survey that I also conducted with my colleague in the Armenian election study. And what we tried to look at was, whether Armenia prefers security over democracy, okay, or whether Armenia prioritizes both. And amidst the security crisis, if a populace is able to suggest that democracy is just as important as security, that is a very, very important indicator of an enduring cultural syndrome. And we saw was that 54% of Armenian society actually suggested that we should prioritize both. So that is a very healthy indicator of a robustly growing democratic culture. The second indicator, the explanatory variable that we address, is the increased citizen trust in political and state institutions. Because political culture consists of a system of beliefs, symbolic expressions, and shared values that contextually define political action, shared clusters of attitudes and political norms and values remain very important and fundamental to the discussion at hand. And perhaps the most important cultural syndrome for a burgeoning democratic culture is the growth of institutional trust among citizens. And for Armenia, institutional trust was almost non-existent in the pre-Velvet political culture. But we did see, however, some shared clusters of democratic attitudes and political norms slowly starting to crystallize. However, during the post-Velvet stage, extensive data demonstrates an exponential increase in institutional trust. And at this time, we have seen shared clusters of democratic attitudes and norms become embedded in Armenia's political culture. And this remains very consistent with the democratization literature that we have within the field of studies. And Armenia's developments have been very consistent with the literature. And the most important indicator that distinguishes democratized societies from democratizing or non-democratizing societies is the magnitude of institutional trust. And so the higher the interpersonal trust citizens have for their political institutions, the more democratic this given society remains. The lower interpersonal trust that citizens have for their political institutions, less democratic or non-democratic those given societies will remain. But why and how are interpersonal trust and institutional trust such important indicators of democratic progress and institutionalization? Okay, why? Well, the broader research pretty much demonstrates that democratic sustainability is not possible without high levels of institutional trust among the citizens. For this reason, high levels of trust is correlated with high levels of trust in political system itself. And so there's a verifiable relationship between growth of civic culture, the fostering of democratic performance, the reproduction of democratic outcomes, and trust in democratic institutions. And just as importantly for me to note is that enhanced interpersonal and institutional trust create platforms within societies that are also conducive to pluralism and consensus-based problem solving. So collectively, institutional trust as a crucial component of democratizing political culture gives legitimacy to the political system and promotes political participation. For this reason, we qualify the whole process of Armenia's enduring cultural syndromes to become embedded in Armenia's burgeoning democratic culture. So, therefore, having covered sort of the conceptual and theoretical underpinnings that I'm using to better understand how the Pashinyan government was able to absorb the political shocks after November 9, right after the ceasefire, we basically need to look at the high levels of institutional and interpersonal trust that he has actually enjoyed even after, quote unquote, losing the war. And this is the data that I called from the 2021 IRA survey that was released in May. And so we see, right, when we look at the institution of the armed forces, okay, 75% favorability rating, very high. When we look at the police, one of the traditionally most hated institutions in Armenia, they actually enjoy a 62% favorability rating. This is an extraordinarily very high level of institutional trust for a post-Soviet society, which again becomes consistent with our discussion of enduring syndromes. And even the Human Rights Defender's Office enjoys a majority support in Armenian society at 52%. And one of the more interesting developments was also of a surprising level of support for local government. We see here at 47%. And of course, in the data, about 15 to 25% of citizens had no response. So the 47, 50, 60 percentiles are actually quite impressive when we consider the numbers. Now, of course, we would assume that after a war, a prime minister's ratings would, severely dip. And while Prime Minister Pashinyan did go from the low 70s, high 60s to the 54 percentile, we are again able to observe that he still remained the most popular politician in the country. And we're going to see how this political capital he has, which is very interesting, tends to resonate very, very well with his base. So in the February IRA survey, his office, the office of the prime minister, had a favorability rating of 54%. By May, it had dipped to 38%. But him personally, right, Pashinyan, the individual, and not the office of prime minister, he personally, his favorability stood at 45% in May. And so he still remained very popular, as we're going to see with some of the other data I present. And this kind of allows us to understand why the post-Velvet government, the post-Velvet movement, of which he happens to be the standard bearer, was able to basically survive the crisis that we saw. And a very, very important and interesting indicator of citizen trust in the Pashinyan government was that when citizens were asked, when sort of the attempt at, a social instability and the rise of the non-democratic parties, which started challenging the post-war government, and that they made the demand for a transitional government, to have a transitional government. When citizens were asked, who do you trust to oversee the snap elections, 62% of society trusted the Pashinyan government. Only 21% supported a potential transitional government. In this context, right, something interesting when we lag the data and observe it stands out. The February 4 survey pretty much did a good job of suggesting where Pashinyan actually stands. And with the results after the snap elections, putting his party in the 53, 54 percentile, we see that his popularity sustained itself. And the 21% of the opposition that we saw in February supporting a transitional government, this was actually the exact number that Kopalyan's Armenian alliance actually got in the recent elections. So these were very, very interesting developments. Proceeding from this assessment, of course, we also kind of want to consider the overarching legacy of the Velvet Revolution and how this legacy reinforced democratic outcomes. So we need to note that the legacy of the Velvet Revolution resolved one of the biggest problems Armenian society had faced since the mid-1990s. And this was the governing elite's crisis of legitimacy. And so the democratic elections of 2018, which basically brought about and finalized the Velvet Revolution, produced the first government in Armenia that did not suffer a crisis of legitimacy since 1991. So the first elections Armenians had in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union, when they elected a new president. Since then, pretty much every government that's come afterward has had a crisis of legitimacy due to, of course, all the vote rigging and all the problems that we have seen. And so this was the first government that basically alleviated the crisis of legitimacy concerns that we had seen being chronic in Armenia's political culture. And I diagnosed 3 factors with respect to the legacy of the Velvet that explains the resilience and electoral success of Prime Minister Pashinyan's party. The first to consider is basically the disparity, between public support for the Pashinyan government and support for the opposition. And this disparity holds constant for both types of oppositions, whether these were the authoritarian vestiges, which we saw get into parliament, or the more constructive democratic opposition prior to the elections that were very critical of the Pashinyan government. Fundamentally, there's a huge disparity in public support that leans towards the Pashinyan government. Second, we saw that citizen trust of Pashinyan and institutional support for his government translates into citizen distrust towards the opposition, which is a very, very interesting development. In this context, the credibility of the opposition forces to increase their popularity actually becomes a reality when they tend to align their policies with the government. But it decreases when they basically engage in behavior that attacks or becomes very critical of the Armenian government. So what we saw was that regardless of the opposition's ideological leanings, or their public support tends to be heavily tied to the Velvet values. And so any political grouping that attacks this government, the presumption is that they're also attacking the Velvet values, and therefore they don't do very well. Any political grouping that aligns with the Velvet values and does not criticize its government, they tend to do a little better. So it's just a very fascinating game of heuristics, this association that the Armenian voter has made. And this clearly has contributed to Pashinyan's political capital, whether fairly or unfairly, of course, but that is what the data suggests. And finally, to a very large extent, right, all of this, as I noted, is connected to the legacy of the Velvet Revolution. How so? Well, the fight against corruption that we've seen the last 3 years, or the fight against abuse of power, of persecution, and all the horrors that Armenian society suffered for the last 30 years are fundamentally equated with the Velvet Revolution as being the remedy to these problems. And for these reasons, Armenia's democratic culture is inherently tied to the Velvet Revolution itself. And since the Pashinyan government represents the culmination or the realization of the Velvet Revolution, the legacy has remained persistent in limiting the capabilities of the opposition even after the ceasefire and all the security crises that Armenia has been facing. And of course, the final explanatory variable as to why the Armenia's democracy has been resilient amidst all the security crisis, it has been the electoral weakness of the opposition. And what we have seen is that the continuity of the Velvet government and thus the resilience of Armenia's democratic breakthrough, demonstrating a very, very robust and continuous trajectory even after cases and cases of a security crisis, whether it was the loss in war, whether it was the ceasefire, whether it has been the current, in the last 4 months, let's use the term current, right? What we have seen the last 4 months with the basic infringement upon our Armenian sovereignty by Azerbaijan there, and then placing forces in our territories, and the continued internecine acts of irredentism and violence by Azerbaijan against Armenia's troops, right? Even with all of these developments, okay, right, we see consistency and resilience with Armenian society, voter and electorate, still favoring a government who has not been able to properly or sufficiently deal with these crises. Why? Because to a very large extent, the opposition is electorally very, very weak. And four general assessments, right, allow us to better understand the power configurations in Armenia's domestic political developments that consistently favor Pashinyan and his civil contract party. The first addresses what I consider to be an exaggeration of instability in Armenia. And what I argue is that Armenia's domestic political theater is far more stable than meets the eye. The general perception in the diaspora, for example, or in much of the social media, tends to depict political developments in Armenia as one of instability and conflict. But the reality on the ground is actually quite different, okay? So the marginal size of the opposition, the latent support for the prime minister, and the overt rejection of society for the non-democratic opposition has mitigated any serious concerns of instability. In this context, Armenia did not so much have societal political instability, but rather instability among the political elite. And so this inter-elite strife, however, did not trickle down to the rest of society. And to this end, fears of bloodshed or public violence never became a reality. The second fact that gives a better explanation of why the opposition has been electorally weak is that in the eyes of the Armenian electorate, the opposition lacks both trust and credibility. And this has resulted in the failure of the anti-democratic opposition to construct a tenable movement. And since the anti-democratic forces are composed of what we call the authoritarian vestiges, they are immediately associated by the Armenian voter with all the political ills and suppression that befell Armenian society under the previous regimes. In this context, the non-democratic opposition consistently failed to escape its crisis of credibility. And third, as we've noted, I'm going to get into a little bit more detail on this down in a second. The Velvet government has immensely benefited from this lack of credibility that the opposition suffers from. And more specifically, the Velvet government has also benefited from the lack of an alternative to its leadership. So in essence, we can actually qualify Pashinyan's recent electoral success as more of a rejection of the authoritarian vestiges than a reaffirmation of his government's policies. And fourth, we have seen that, relatively speaking, democratic resilience or the continuation of the Velvet values primarily to the fact that Pashinyan's or the Velvet government's electoral base has actually held very, very strongly. And I'm going to present data in a bit that kind of explain this in more details. And so, when we observe data prior to the elections, right, all indicators were clear on few observations. Primarily, Kopalyan had a very steep hill to climb, while all Pashinyan had to do was basically hold the proverbial fortress. And survey data clearly attests to this. The IRA survey, for example, clearly showed that Pashinyan's favorability in May, right, was at 45%, while Khochatyan stood at 20%. At the same time, a lot of the respondents, right, gave the answer that they did not select anyone. And this was 55% of the respondents. And we qualify them to be the undecideds. But what we saw on election night was that these undecideds heavily broke for civil contract. They heavily broke for Pashinyan. And so the shift in Armenia's democratic culture and general citizen trust in the Pashinyan government, regardless of all the flaws that this government may have, pretty much made the electoral hill very difficult for Khochatyan to climb. And this is why he was not able to break the 22% ceiling. He was consistently stuck at that. While Pashinyan was able to grow into the 53% range because of the undecideds heavily breaking for him. What I have here is data that I was part of conducting our pre-election survey. And, our data clearly showed that Pashinyan remained the most popular candidate. And we had his rating at approximately 35%. And our survey was conducted about week and a half before the snap elections. And if we look here, right, he remained the most popular candidate at 35%. The only person that came close to him at 21% was Artsakh, and he represented the Republic Party, not Republican, the Republic Party, which was a pro-government, pro-democracy opposition, but they did not make they didn't pass the threshold to enter parliament. But that's besides the point. Fundamentally, Pashinyan in the poll was the most popular politician. Khochatyan's popularity stood at 18%. Okay, but his biggest problem, okay, what was more telling was that his disapproval stood at 62%. So his approval was very, very high. And him and a couple of other candidates who had exceedingly high disapproval ratings were pretty much those who were associated with the pre-Velvet regimes. And so the stigma of being connected with the previous regime was pretty much a severe obstacle that the non-democratic parties or the authoritarian vestiges were not able to overcome. And this, of course, contributed to Pashinyan's electoral victory, and it limited or created a very weak electoral opposition. And the data that I have here, which was also from our survey, pretty much explains a lot of this. And I argue that when it came to trust and credibility, this was pretty much the electoral game changer. And in our pre-election survey, our findings on citizen perceptions of candidates clearly demonstrates this. And what we see is that Pashinyan remained the most honest candidate in the field, right? His honesty is at 30%. Nobody came close to this. And he was also considered to be the least corrupt candidate. Only 2% found him to be corrupt. So that is a very, very impressive number. Khochatyan, on the end, was viewed as one of the least honest and most corrupt candidates. In this context, right, Khochatyan was not able to escape the very high negativity he had in the various spheres that we've addressed. And what's more interesting is that although Khochatyan was considered to be far more competent than Pashinyan, right, this did not matter because he clearly suffered from a crisis of credibility. And so this is why I keep going on the whole, go back to the notion of institutional interpersonal trust, that citizens considered candidate X, right, to be very competent, but they chose candidate Y because they trusted candidate Y exponentially more. And so trust was the defining factor. Credibility was a defining factor in these elections, I would argue, based on the data. And more specifically, right, leading to our fourth assessment, which I said I'm going to elaborate on, which discusses Pashinyan's electoral base. And we saw that his base remarkably sustained itself. And Prime Minister Pashinyan's support remains continuously strong. And he seems to be the first political leader, if you will, in Armenia who's actually demonstrated a notion of a continuous electoral base. So in American or Western democratic politics, having an electoral base is very common. In Armenia, this is actually a novelty because we've never had institutionalized parties. And so seeing a continuous consistency through two electoral cycles in 2018 and in 2021, and seeing a consistent pattern of performance from his base is a very important indicator that he actually has a resilient base. And over here, for example, I have the socio-demographic results from our survey, which pretty much give interesting indicators on the sectors of society and the voting blocks that make up the constituents of each of the leading candidates in the 2021 elections. And we saw that Kocharyan's voters, for example, were educationally more affluent than Pashinyan's. As you see, 42% of Kocharyan's voters had graduate degrees, while only 23% of Pashinyan's voters had held graduate degrees. At the same time, Pashinyan's voter base is heavily dominated by high school graduates or those who held vocational degrees. So a very clear indicator that Pashinyan's lower middle class and lower class support was pretty much going up against Kocharyan's upper middle class support. So these were, broadly speaking, the educational demographics of Pashinyan's base. And when I disaggregated the data of the election results and observed outcomes at the local levels, and this is by Armenia's regions, what they call Nerses. And the data was called from the, I took it from the Central Election Commission in Armenia. It provides further support and demonstration of how strongly Prime Minister Pashinyan's base held. And when you simply glance at this, you see that civil contract won a majority. Okay, they won a majority in every region of Armenia except for Yerevan. Okay, in Yerevan they won a plurality, not a majority, which I'm discussing in a second. Okay, but in every region of Armenia outside of Yerevan, they won a majority. Now, considering the heavy economic disparity between Yerevan and the regions, and the electoral makeup of the regions being primarily dominated by the lower and lower middle class voter, Pashinyan's consistent electoral dominance of every region aligns with the premise that his electoral base remains very strong and very powerful outside of Yerevan. And, you know, as an example, right, if you simply look at Sunik, okay, the fact that civil contract was able to win Sunik, which was supposed to be a Kocharyan stronghold, further reaffirms the strength of Pashinyan's base. And what was more interesting, if we look at, for example, also the region of Gerarkunik, right, which is where you have Vartanis, where you have Azeri encroachment in the area, and we have a lot of concerns of security, okay? Again, an area that's really suffering under the current security crisis. Gerarkunik heavily went towards Pashinyan, towards civil contract at 65.9, pretty much at 66%, where Kocharyan was barely able to garner about 14-15%. So we saw that even in areas such as Sunik, such as Gerarkunik, where the security crisis was very acute to those living in the border areas, they still voted for the prime minister's party. So very interesting indicator that his base held very strong, even in those areas that had severe security concerns. And then we, of course, get to Yerevan. Yerevan's very interesting. With respect to Yerevan, well, as I noted, civil contract did win. It did not achieve a majority. Okay, it won by plurality. It was 41% civil contract against 28% of the Armenian alliance. Now, considering that Yerevan remains the economically most affluent region on the electoral map, Kocharyan had his best performance in Yerevan. But in order for the Armenian alliance to have had any chance of overperforming, they had to win Yerevan. And they did not come close. They only won again within Yerevan in the most affluent areas of Yerevan. So when we observe the districts, right, the results are very straightforward. Kocharyan carried the economically affluent districts of Kentron, Artsakh and, relatively speaking, Nork-Marash. Okay, in Artsakh, he won by 4%. In Kentron, he won by 6%, and in Nork-Marash, he won by 6%. And of course, Kentron is the wealthiest area of Armenia, followed by Artsakh. So he did perform quite well in these affluent areas. And there is a correlation, as some studies that have showed, between real estate prices in Yerevan and voter preference. And this was pretty much very, very consistent, right? The wealthier areas went for Kopalyan. So this was a very, very interesting development. But nonetheless, in all the other districts of Yerevan, it was pretty much a strong domination by Pashinyan. And I do have the raw numbers just to give you a better perspective. I only included the percentiles where Kopalyan won, so there's more, nuance there. But if you look at the raw numbers, right, the dominance is quite straightforward, especially when you look at, for example, at Erebuni, which is very blue collar, okay, and tends to have a lot of, traditionally speaking, criminal elements that were working very hard for Kopalyan. They still underperformed. Or when you look at second from the bottom, Shengavit, one of the more poor areas of Yerevan, a complete dominance by Pashinyan. So we see that in the lower income and lower middle class and middle class areas, civil contracted exceptionally well, even within Yerevan, when observing the disaggregated data. And so overarchingly, right, what we're seeing is that Armenia's post-war political climate is most cogently qualified by observing the burgeoning democratic culture that is developed in Armenia. And this has supported the continuous trajectory of increased citizen trust in the institutions and values of the Velvet Revolution. But as importantly, okay, we have to concede the fact that although we saw a lot of political parties in the parliamentary elections, there were 26 of them, and so there was an attempt at pluralism, the fact remains that Armenian society still does not see a credible alternative to the Velvet government. And so all things being equal, however, the political capital of Pashinyan is not infinite. And if the security crisis persists without sufficient mitigation, and as the political configurations in Armenia shift with other democratic alternatives possibly entering the political field, Armenia's next parliamentary elections could very likely bring about more pluralism. But as long as the opposition comes from the authoritarian vestiges, the flag bearers of the Velvet Revolution will keep getting a pass from the Armenian people, okay, regardless of how they continue governing with trial and error. So important to understand is that Armenia's security architecture, as weak as it's become because of the war, and I will discuss about components of the security architecture in our question and answer with the role of Russia and the institutional reforms that we're seeing. But fundamentally, right, noting that the security architecture at this point cannot sufficiently resolve the security crisis that Armenia is facing, citizens still tend to place trust in what they consider to be an honest yet relatively incompetent leadership over the alternative, which may have perceptions of competence, but suffers from a severe crisis of credibility. And that pretty much covers it. Thank you very much, and Shorakal soon.
Thank you, Dr. Kopalyan, for that very interesting presentation. So we're going to give a chance for people to write questions in the chat. And while they're doing that, I have a couple of questions, and maybe we can just start it off with a couple of things. So one question that I've had is about the person of Pashinyan. So this Velvet Revolution developed in 2018 and kind of replaced the previous regime. But who really was Pashinyan? Was it a case of just personal charisma, or did he actually have a group of people that, or a platform rather, that really appealed to people? What was it that really catapulted him to the front?
Well, it was basically the circumstances. He happened to be in the right place at the right time. When we study democratic breakthroughs in a post-COVID space, we see that various indicators have to click. One, for example, the non-democratic leader has to be very, very unpopular. So, for example, like Putin seems to be and happens to be very popular. Okay, so that in of itself is an issue for the opposition. Sarkisyan, at that point, who was prime minister after he shifted the constitution with the referendum, he was very unpopular. So that in itself was an issue. Second, when we saw protests basically exploding, Pashinyan was one part of the equation when he started basically with his My Step, the step from Gyumri to Yerevan and the whole movement of garnering support. But while he was doing that, civic society and a lot of sort of youth organizations and groups had also began a process of galvanizing and mobilizing opposition to the non-democratic government. So Pashinyan, when he kind of marched into Yerevan and he already had the youth and civic society mobilized, they joined together, and due to Pashinyan's charisma and his political experience, he ended up taking over the movement. But fundamentally, it was sort of a very interesting set of developments that kind of clicked together and allowed Pashinyan to utilize his exceptional skill set to push through the Velvet Revolution, to have the democratic breakthrough. So it was a combination of his personal charisma, his likability, his honesty, the fact that he wasn't tainted by anything from the previous system, as well as Armenia's very, very robust civic society. We have to remember that. They played an extraordinarily powerful role, and they continue to do that as far as resilience is concerned.
Okay, again, if you have questions, please go ahead and ask them. There's a question, are there business oligarchs in Armenia working with Russia?
So the current qualification or assessment from a conceptual lens as to whether Armenia has oligarchs or not has been pretty much disqualified. Meaning, oligarch is someone who basically cheats the system, gets beneficial treatment of the system, and does use the legal system to have unfair competition. We don't have that in Armenia anymore at this point. So you do have tycoons, wealthy people who do have an oligarchic legacy and who became wealthy by virtue of being oligarchs in the past. But currently, in the current economic system, they are not qualified as oligarchs. Now, these tycoons, do they work with, economically speaking, do they have economic relations with Russia? Of course they do. Russia is Armenia's biggest trade partner. That's just how it is. Armenia is part of the Eurasian Economic Union. So they're part of a same economic customs union with Russia. And so you do have a lot of that. For example, Gagik Tsarukyan, who has a prosperous Armenia party, not only does he have a lot of investments in Russia, he has extensive investments, for example, in Belarus and Ukraine. So it's not uncommon. It's very common for economically affluent Armenian businessmen to have economic investments in the post-Soviet space. And with Russia being the focal point, the economic core of the post-Soviet space, it's very, very common practice.
Okay, we have another question. It's regarding the economics in Armenia. Has there been economic growth during Pashinyan's term as prime minister? So in the 2 years since the Velvet, or 3 years now since the Velvet Revolution.
Yes, in 2018, Armenia recorded extensive economic growth over the 7th and 8th percentile, and the trajectory was close to 14%. Of course, from an economic lens, it's usually the policies of the previous year that contribute to developments in the following year. So a healthier indicator would be 2019. And in 2019, the economic indicators were also very robust. And then, of course, COVID hit, and then the war hit. The current indicators are also very positive, but then, of course, some would argue any post-war society or any post-pandemic society has a very, very quick recovery rate. Therefore, the numbers are kind of inflated. Be that as it may, but on a consistent basis, the economic indicators and growth rates have been quite healthy for this government. And, a lot of that has been, laws that basically got rid of unhealthy competition. Armenia does have a market economy, and tax collection has been pretty much consistent with the law. Bribery has been wiped out, systemic corruption, that is, and all that has contributed to, relatively speaking, rather an exponential growth in the economy.
And then there's a kind of a corollary question. What is currently Armenia's main source of exports? What are its most important exports for the economy?
Right. For the longest time, Armenia has relied on mining. So mining remains one of its biggest industries. That's what it sells to the outside world. And in the past, the mines were owned, as was initially asked, by certain oligarchs connected to the previous elites. But that, of course, is being changed, and tax collection is being changed as well. So mining remains one of the biggest commodities that is exported, if you will, or natural resources. A lot of the exports also, Armenia has grown in the IT sector, so human capital, technological know-how. We're seeing a lot of foreign direct investment from big IT companies, but also you have a lot of our independent contractors in Armenia who work for companies outside of Armenia remotely. So we're seeing a growth in that. So in that context, it's kind of a mixed bag, but mining remains dominant. There's some farming going on. Armenia does send out a lot of fruits, vegetables, things of that sort to the Russian markets, to the post-Soviet markets. But again, these have not been fully developed. Armenia's agriculture sector is also in the process of modernizing as well. So there's observable progress in that sector as well. And of course, tourism is domestic, right? It's not something that's being exported, but tourism has become close to 16-17% of Armenia's economy. So, hospitality, if you will. So there's a combination of factors as far as the economics are concerned.
A little bit earlier, you mentioned about the role of Russia, and you wanted to say maybe something, but I want to ask a question dealing with Russia's position towards Armenia's Velvet Revolution and towards the political developments that you just were discussing, because Armenia was part of the Soviet Union for some 70 years and is still considered to be part of the Soviet or Russian economic sphere and also security sphere. But can you just tell us in a very kind of a nutshell, how does President Putin, how does Russia see these developments? Do they see them as in any way endangering the relationship or not?
No, not really. So what we saw in 2018 when the Velvet Revolution happened, there was a lot of discussion, is Armenia having another color revolution, right? Georgia, Ukraine, these are qualified as color revolutions. And what this means is you're having a democratic breakthrough, but there are geopolitical implications where the given country wants to escape Russia's orbit and thus lean towards the West. And from the very outset, right, Pashinyan and the Velvet Revolutionary leaders said, this is not a color revolution. This has no geopolitical implication. This is a very Armenia-centric democratic breakthrough that we're trying to attempt. Russia, of course, whether they were initially convinced or not is besides the point. But when you look at Armenia's record or behavior since 2018, after the Velvet, they have basically voted at the UN platform, at international platforms, consistent with Russia. Armenia has not engaged in any behavior that has actually contradicted any Russian interest. So if we're going to talk, if one asks the question, how does the post-Velvet government's policies towards Russia different than the pre-Velvet government's policies towards Russia? The answer would be not much. There isn't much of a difference. So I think towing the line, because Armenia has no other options due to the geopolitical and security configurations, Russia became convinced through time that indeed the Velvet was not a geopolitical or pro-Western movement, and there were no anti-Russian sentiments involved. And this is why Russia did not interfere. Okay, Russia interfered in Georgia. Russia very robustly interfered in Ukraine. And when we saw the recent democratic movements or attempts at one in Belarus, Russia sent all kind of support to the Lukashenko government. With Armenia, Russia sent no support to the Sarkisian government to clamp down on the Velvet movement. In this context, until Russia is given any indicators that the current government might act against its interest, it has no interest to act against Armenia. And considering the fact that Armenia's policies in the security and the foreign sector have been aligned with Russia's geopolitical interests, we see that Putin has developed a very, very positive relationship with Pashinyan. And even after the recent elections, where there was talks of the opposition not accepting the results or maybe starting protests, one statement by Putin simply saying Pashinyan won by a landslide, I congratulate him, pretty much cut off the opposition at the knees. So these are very important indicators suggesting that Russia has actually become very comfortable with this government, because their position is that I don't care how democratic you are domestically, your foreign policy and security policy, as long as it's aligned with us, there would be no issues. So Russia's all about is the geopolitical and regional interest. They're not so much concerned about the domestic values, because Armenia is never going to be able to escape, as far as the current configurations are concerned, Russia's orbit.
Okay, there's another question. It deals with a little bit of about Armenia's political system. So the question is, but I think it's a slightly different question. It says, how many years does the president have before re-election? But we're really talking about the prime minister. So what is the election cycle in Armenia? How many years are there elections? And then I'm going to add another part to the question. Since now Kopalyan and the previous president Sarkisyan lost, presumably they're not going to be players anymore in the near future. Do you see the emergence of any new opposition figures with some traction among the people? So first question, just about when the next elections are.
With respect to Armenia's electoral system, being a parliamentary system, you have elections every 5 years. But of course, anytime the prime minister could resign, which we saw what happened recently, parliament is dissolved, and then you have snap parliamentary elections. So that could happen in time. But as far as a continuous process, elections are every 5 years. Just like any most parliamentary democracies, there are no term limits on a prime minister, of course. So if every 5 years, Pashinyan's party, civil contract, or whatever coalition they form, win and he's elected, he remains prime minister. This is why, for example, in Germany, right, Angela Merkel has been in power for so long, even though their system, of course, is a little different. Okay, or why in UK we saw Tony Blair in power for such a prolonged period of time, so on and so forth. Potentially speaking, Pashinyan could continuously be in power if his party keeps winning, majority in parliament. So it's every 5 years, but parliament obviously elects the prime minister. So, for example, hypothetically, right, tomorrow, if his party has lost confidence in him, they could do a vote of confidence. If it fails, they can appoint someone else as prime minister, vote someone else. So the prime minister's position is reliant on his party, and the elections are every 5 years for parliament. With respect to the second part of the question, Kopalyan is not out of the picture because his party, or his coalition, if you will, still has 29 seats in parliament. Yes, they don't make up much. They can't obstruct any of the processes. But fundamentally, the underlying premise is that he's the leader, even though he'd take his mandate. So he's not in parliament, right? He refused to be a member of parliament, but he does run the coalition behind the scenes. And so the economic resources, assumption is a lot of the strategizing, he still remains the authority. So the legislative behavior of the Armenia Alliance is still dictated by Kopalyan. So Kopalyan has not left the electoral field. Similarly, the third party in parliament, which is the I Have Honor coalition, weird name they came up with, right? That coalition is dominated by Sarkisyan. Again, he's not in parliament, right? But he's the dominant source behind it. And so in that context, Sarkisyan and Kopalyan still have some involvement in politics. And that's a good question you brought up, Barlow, in sense that as long as people like Kopalyan, Sarkisyan, what we call the authoritarian vestiges, as long as they're around, as long as they're the alternative, Pashinyan is going to be basically the preference of the people. So when we're not going to see new democratic forces coming to the picture, and it's really important concern or an observation we had with the recent elections, you had healthy 5-6 very solid democratic parties, okay, that competed with democratic credentials, and they could have been, big proponents of pluralism. But a lot of voters who were sympathetic to these parties, they shifted and voted for Pashinyan as strategic voters because they feared the return of Kopalyan and the authoritarian vestiges. So as long as that fear persists, right, no Democratic Party is going to be able to make inroads because citizens are going to tilt towards Pashinyan as a buffer against the authoritarian vestiges. And therein lies the sort of the issue that we have right now.
So one more question here deals with Pashinyan's relationship with the church in Armenia. And I think that means both the Apostolic Church, perhaps, and other new churches, Protestant Church or other churches. But let's talk about state religious relations, because I know it's been problematic, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about it.
Right, that's a very good question. The relationship between the Pashinyan government and the church is really one of animosity. Okay, and there's no surprise there because, in the same fashion that the previous regime was corrupt and abused its authority, the church leadership, not the church itself, right, or the faithful, but the church leadership itself engaged in the same type of behavior. We saw sort of an inter-alignment between a lot of the oligarchs and the church leadership. In that context, the church fundamentally opposed the Velvet Revolution, and they did everything to obstruct it. And the church has been adamantly against Pashinyan, and they basically got again the second, right? The head of the church came out and advocated for the prime minister's resignation after the war. So there's been a continuous pattern of the church and the government clashing. But there are, of course, more deeper issues. Godegin II is known as being Kocharyan's patriarch, being Kocharyan's Catholicus, because there's a lot of evidence that we know in his 1997 selection to becoming the Catholicus. Kocharyan did utilize a lot of informal resources and political pressure to get him elected. So their relationship was very, very symbiotic. And so the church leadership was intertwined with the authoritarian vestiges. And so in that context, yes, the relationship has been very, very bad. It's been very, very conflictual. This is why Pashinyan has spoken of a need for a revolution, if you will, something like the Velvet, but within the church institutions to cleanse the church of the corruption and so on and so forth. So the relationship, yes, is not very good within each other.
Okay, I'm going to ask the final question tonight, just as to kind of sum up, is the question about what is actually Pashinyan's platform? So what does he stand for that has made him also become popular once he got into power?
Okay, right. His main platform, and this is one of the one would say the relative deficiencies in that they have not been able to cogently develop an ideological framework for their government. But that being said, usually nascent democracies that don't have institutionalized parties do not develop or cannot develop platforms because Armenian society doesn't engage in nuanced debate. So in the US, if you debate gun rights or abortion, you don't debate nuanced issues like that in Armenia. It's basically fighting corruption and having a healthy economy and having basic security. So due to lack of nuanced and salient issues that are common in democracies, political parties in Armenia have not produced robust platforms. Now, that being said, can we qualify as the platform of Pashinyan? It would be him being a reformist, okay, right? Combating corruption, combating abuse of power, changing the previous system, democratizing, him being a reformist. And so his whole thing is, I'm a centrist with very strong leanings towards institutional reform, but at the same time, a very strong security doctrine. So he says to be, if we're going to use the left-right continent that we use in Western politics, he would be center-right as far as security is concerned and foreign policy is concerned, but it would be relatively center-left when we talk about social spending, social issues, and things of that sort. But his platform that's made him popular is his anti-corruption and pro-reform platform.
Thank you very much. I'd like to, on behalf of the Armenian Studies program, thank our speaker, Dr. Kopalyan, for really an excellent analysis, bringing in some really interesting data, polling data, and some information about what's happening in Armenia. It's a really strong start to our fall lecture series, so I want to thank you for that. Thank everyone for joining us, and to remind you that our next presentation will be on Friday, September the 17th at 7 p.m. with Dr. Suren Manukyan speaking about the Armenian genocide in a three-part series. So on behalf of the Armenian